then what we're going to do is we're going to have the remaining time of a question and answer session according to what the topic is and how our three speakers have spoken on it. Then at the end of that, we will summarize that and have a across our three speakers and have and then Lee will summarize the whole topic together. So as part of this, when we require input from you to so that you can participate as well, and so that as you listen to our speakers, if you have questions that come up from what they say, or you've brought questions with you, please put them in the chat, and we'll go to the chat and work our way through those questions during the question and answer session. And in doing that, if you can put your name and where you're from against your question as well, so that we know who you are. And to facilitate the whole thing, I just ask if everybody could keep their cameras and mics muted, cameras off and mics muted, just so that it flows more easily and we can keep our attention on our three speakers. So moving into our session, let me introduce our three speakers for this evening. Our three speakers are the Reverend Dr. Mark Siddall, and he is a priest in charge. He's a priest in charge at St. James Quedgeley in the Diocese of Gloucester. Now, Mark is also a climate scientist with a long experience both intellectually, academically, and in terms of involvement in not just climate, but the whole space surrounding climate. Our second speaker is the Reverend Margot Hodson, and Margot is a director of Theology and Education at the John Ray Initiative. And for many years, the John Ray Initiative has been an organization connecting science, environment, and the Christian faith for sustainability and action. And again, has been right in this whole space. And our third speaker is Steve Knight, who is a GreenFaith Fellow and a vestry member of the Church of the Holy Trinity in New York City. And of course, New York is one of those places where climate and sustainability and creation care is perhaps hotly contested. So we have three fantastic speakers to listen to tonight. And our first speaker will be Mark, followed by Margot, and then followed by Steve. So if Mark, if you would like to take up the baton, please.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Lee, for this kind invitation to speak tonight and to be part of this panel. I began my career with a PhD in the National Oceanography Centre, Southampton. And as I was studying oceanography, most of the focus became into climate change, because the oceans at that time in the early noughties were one of the remaining unanswered real questions. I'm not talking about the kind of false put up questions from climate denialists. With my PhD, I then moved on to the University of Bern in Switzerland and Columbia University in New York City before moving back to UK and the University of Bristol. In that time, I've published 50 peer-reviewed papers in the physical science of climate change, including a number in Nature and Science, the top-tier journals. That whole time, really the whole conversation among climate scientists was just the assumption that, you know, we would explain the challenge at hand, explain the science, and the only reasonable response would be to come up with solutions from whichever part of the political spectrum. It's not true that scientists have some kind of left-wing bias. With the challenge of climate change, I'm more than happy to accept solutions from right and left. No one's quite got this right yet. But that just wasn't the case. I mean, we've been explaining climate change since the 70s in this current phase of being particularly concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, and the kind of careful, patient, depoliticized explanation just hasn't got us anywhere. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that as climate science has evolved in this recent phase, it's co-evolved with the internet. My very first paper, just on email, I got a barrage of very odd responses from people called things like the voice of reason, anonymously. And that was, so that was the early noughties. So it was predominantly kind of email denial. But as time went on and the search engines became ever more powerful, it was only 5 years ago when Google stopped putting climate denialist stuff at the top of the search engine. If I can give an example, a piece of work that was completed while I was at the University of Bern, which was to take the longest ice core from Antarctica that had ever been taken. The snow accumulating on ice on Antarctica accumulates isotopes which are sensitive to temperature and accumulates the trapped greenhouse gases, so you can have a record of greenhouse gas relationships with temperature over hundreds of thousands of years. That piece of work, a hugely collaborative piece of work from the center of Antarctica, costing hundreds of millions of pounds, and the organizing of international treaties and things like that, 10, 15 years in the making. The day it was published, 100,000 denialist kind of tropes can be created at no cost of time or money or effort. And for a long time, the search engines preferred that masked bulk of false information to the real information. And the fact that climate science was learning to deal with this false information at the same time as the science itself evolving, I think has created a particular difficult climate. And so there's straight away this relationship between science and technology, which is not straightforward. There's another thing, which is climate science and more broadly any real system-based planetary science, including ecology and those kind of sciences, can never be reductive. And so climate science kind of butts up against a very kind of simplistic, modernist, reductive kind of science. And because a lot of our modern identity is based on those kind of things, it's something of a crisis of identity for a lot of people, realizing that we can't simply approach science or technology in this reductive kind of a way. So this process of trying to patiently explain, for me, I got to the point where I realized, well, however much we patiently explain, we're never going to get the point across. And I came to the realization that climate change is a physical symptom of a spiritual problem, and that we needed to look to the wisdom resources, the faith resources, to really understand how we would go about that cultural transformation, spiritual transformation that I think we might need in order to tackle climate change. If we think about the way it's phrased, even partly, subconsciously perhaps in the pamphlet for today, we're looking at how humanity reduces impact while continuing to thrive. And there's a question there, does that put thriving in line with consumer capitalism? Are we kind of assuming that our, living abundantly, as it's put in the Gospel of John, is only consumer capitalism? Because I'm not sure about those kind of assumptions. I think that some of the richness that we need to re-explore here is not simply the richness of consumerism, but we're looking at spiritual riches which can help us through the journey, through the wilderness of rediscovering who we are in the face of this, which is I think there's some really deep thinking and work on ourselves that we need to do around this. Really, the currency of Scripture is life and death. Those are the currencies of Scripture. Life in abundance in John, I don't think equates to greed or consumer capitalism. I think it's a more equitable, a win-win approach to living on Earth so that all life can live more abundantly together. That looking for the win-win. I think even in terms of capitalist growth, if you really think about capitalist growth, the only genuine net growth is when there's a win-win. There's no genuine net growth for all of us unless there's a win-win. And I think those are the kind of things that we need to be. That's the way we need to approach our economics and technology with regard to climate change. I'm just going to close with a final thought, which is that currently the Church of England, lots of churches around the world are emphasizing, justice, and by that they were talking about justice for human beings, those who are poor. And it's absolutely true that those who are the most poor will suffer the most. But this reminds me a lot of when, as scientists, we were trying to explain climate change to the broader public and to politicians, which is we always did it as if those politicians and the broader public were saints. We know really from the evidence of the cross that we're not saints, we're all sinners. And that I think that if we concentrate only on an altruistic justice kind of thing, that we won't get there. One of the really hardest things to accept is that in climate change, we're all poor. There are very, very few people on this planet who can avoid being affected by climate change. If I give an example, the place we go on holiday every summer in Maine had a huge storm in January. On that, absolutely much worse because of climate change. There's the one peninsula we go to of the hundreds of peninsulas in Maine. The damage was in the many hundreds of millions. We happen to have wealthy friends there, probably have wealth in the order of tens of millions. And I said, you've got to have your kind of wealth to survive this. And he looked at me aghast because they were not finding it easy to rebuild with that kind of money. No, I
thank
think
you,
with
Mark.
climate change, we're all the poor. That's the key thing. So
we're all poor. Yes. Yes,
thanks,
that's very good. Thank you, Marcus. And I think your point about it being a physical symptom of a spiritual problem gets to the heart of it from a human perspective, and what thriving is going to mean, and what is thriving. So thank you for that, and we'll move straight into Margot. Thank you, Margot.
Thank you. Well, my name is Margot Hodson, and I'm an ordained Anglican priest. I've served in church ministry in parishes and university chaplaincy for 23 years. I hold degrees in both geography and theology, and it was as a geography undergraduate that I began to put my Christian faith together with my passion for the natural world in a little group in my department. Currently, I'm self-supporting, and I serve as Director of Theology and Education at the John Ray Initiative, which is an organisation seeking to combine science, environment and faith in ways that lead to sustainability and action. JRI was founded in 1997 by a number of senior professors, including climate scientist Sir John Horton and ecologist Sam Berry, because they saw a need to resource the church to respond to the environmental crisis. And climate change is just one of 9 planetary boundaries, of at least 6 of them are over the limit. And so it's only one of 6 major problems that we are facing at the moment. My work is in education and research, and I frequently work in partnership with my husband, Martin, who's a research scientist and a university lecturer who's got considerable experience in communicating science in the public sphere, making it understandable to those with less scientific qualification. We often bridge the gap between research at university level and for church ministers and congregations who want to hear about this work, but hear about it at an accessible level. And we teach in seminaries and colleges and on courses. We especially do work with those training to be ministers and other church leaders. And we also teach in churches, and we tend to write quite a lot. I've published over 40 publications at a variety of levels. Our most recent publication is by Grove Books and is on the ethics of environmental management. And it has the subtitle, does stewardship lead us down a blind alley? And that's because stewardship as an ethic has been heavily critiqued by Christian scholars in recent years. And so we pair environmental management with it because many secular management initiatives use stewardship as an undergirding principle. There's even now a journal called Environmental Stewardship. And for this reason, stewardship does resonate with environmental scientists and activists and those who are environmentalists of other faiths. So I feel it's a shame that Christians are kind of, saying, well, maybe we should be losing this at the very time when other people are taking it on. So I've put the case to retain stewardship, but to modify it, to understand it, to understand the weaknesses and sort of look at it perhaps in a slightly different way, maybe to be more interrelational in our understanding. And I'd like to just briefly bring you an example of that sort of approach to stewardship, which is also an example of using technology to respond to the environmental crisis. And it's the work of a friend, and she's a member of one of my former churches. Georgina Campbell-Flatter leads an organisation called tomorrownow.org. And farmers in many parts of the world are struggling because the weather has become unpredictable. So they don't know when to plant, they don't know when to harvest. And if they get it wrong, they can lose their harvest, which can be at best a loss of livelihood. That would happen in developed countries such as the UK and the USA. But in other parts of the world, it can lead to severe hunger and even famine and death. By 2030, 200 million Africans will face 2 degrees of warming, threatening global food security and pushing millions into poverty. Together with her team and partners, Georgie is transforming weather system management to ensure that everyone can adapt and thrive to the changing climate. So farmers who are signed up to her project can have very localized weather forecasts, which they can pick up on their phones. And this helps them to adapt to less predictable climate and increases their potential to have a livable yield of their crops. Tomorrow's Now's project in East Africa is supported by the Gates Foundation. And George's aim is to have 100 million climate resilient smallholder farmers in Africa by 2030. And she's based in MIT, although she works in the UK. When I look at the sheer scale of the environmental crisis, it's easy to be overwhelmed. When I looked at the very mixed response to the crisis from governments around the world, it's easy to lose heart completely. Like Mark, I assumed in 2002, when I first went to a really big climate conference, I assumed governments would see the obvious science and would take note and we would have action. And it's been 22 years of seeing that not happen, and that is very concerning. But I believe that one way forward is made up of initiatives like Tomorrow.Now, which allows people to adapt. It's also about having a faith that is resilient and able to face whatever comes, not to lose hope when the world doesn't seem to have much hope, not to become otherworldly and taking it right through to thinking, well, never mind, one day Jesus will come back and everything will be fine. But having a resilient hope that will give us the strength to be in the world that we are called to live in now, and this very difficult century, where a lot of these difficulties will come in together with the political and instability and migration and other things that will go with it. So thank you very much. And I've mentioned 3 things, and I'm going to just press a button so that the links to those will go into chat if anyone just want to follow them up a bit more. I know I need to just keep this very brief.
Thank you very much, Margot, especially for that example of people being able to use technology where they are for weather, to see what weather and climate is doing for their livelihoods and for the pressures that people are under, and also talking about resilience. just a reminder to our listeners, please put your any questions you have into the chat along with your name and location, so that once we get into the questions, we can quickly work through our questions. And so now I'll just hand over to our third speaker, Steve in New York. Steve, please.
Well, thanks to everyone. Thanks, Mark and Margot. Two terrific presentations, very rich discussion. Appreciate that. One of the touchstones for me in discussions of technology, work, and a sustainable Earth will always be Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. In the section of his encyclical titled The Globalization of the Technocratic Paradigm, Francis criticizes what he believes to be our one-dimensional paradigm for technology, a way of thinking that prioritizes power and domination over people and the earth. Quote, "Science and technology are not neutral," Francis writes, "and we, quote, need to slow down and look at reality in a different way to appropriate the positive and sustainable progress which has been made, but also to recover the values and great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur." I should add that unfortunately, the message of Laudato Si has been met with indifference or even outright hostility by many of Francis's flock. A prominent lay Roman Catholic activist told me about 2 years after the encyclical was published that he believes Laudato Si is being read more in non-Catholic congregations than in Catholic ones. My second point is on the role that technology has played in shaping workers' lives, both inside and outside the workplace. From the Luddites who roamed across the English countryside, destroying looms in the early 19th century, to workers who rebelled against Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management of labor processes, to the hackers and free software innovators of Silicon Valley. Workers have repeatedly questioned whether changing technologies are benefiting their lives. Their anxieties are real. A recent paper from Goldman Sachs says that up to 2/3 of jobs in the US and Europe are exposed to some degree of AI automation, while one science report for the BBC predicts that 90% of all news stories will be written by machines by 2040. While some of you might question the relevancy of the future of work at today's forum for the faith-centered, I believe that changes in the workplace are partly responsible for the significant decline in membership among most mainline congregations, Episcopal included, over the past generation. Congregations depend on members' financial contributions to meet their budgets, and the increasing precarity and contingency of many workers that many workers now face because of AI and related technologies is surely making many more reluctant to commit to church membership. I will conclude on a personal note. I received a lung transplant about 2.5 months ago. I am grateful to God, the hospital staff, and my caregiver beyond words for receipt of this life-saving procedure. But I also acknowledge that delivering this transplant depended on a high degree of technology at a level unavailable to a vast majority of the world's population. This is perhaps the greatest challenge we face today, extending the positive benefits of technology to a greater share of our fellow humanity, while mitigating technology's many negative effects on the quality of our lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve, especially bringing up that point about precarity of workers, and because not just that doesn't just have an effect on their commitment within congregations and denominations, but also right across society, because I would guess that workers are in a precarious, feeling that their lives are precarious, are not going to commit to investment of themselves in their communities and so on, and might just pull up their personal drawbridge and so on. So thank you to the three of our speakers. We now have time for questions, and so if you would like to put your questions in the chat, that would be very helpful. And can I just draw attention to Margot's? If you look in the chat, you will see Margot's links there. So what I'd just like to do is perhaps kick off with my own question to start with for the three of you. Going back to what Mark said in his talk, was there's a lot of conflict around the environment and climate, and how society grapples with the things around this. How should people of faith, not just Christians, address conflict in regard to this? Because the conflict seems to not just be personal, but with also the way we organize for society. So what are some of the things you think we could do to, as people of faith and as Christians, to address conflict in these areas?
So I can make a start. I think, you know, when we first met, and I said my point about, you know, working with hundreds of scientists, naively expecting that to carefully explain the science and the nature of the challenge, people would respond. The funny thing is, of course, at first, people did famously, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher said this is the biggest problem facing humanity. It's really interesting to reflect back on that time, because that was before the tidal wave of false information and manipulation of information, and the strategy after strategy that we've been bombarded with since. So one of the things around that conflict is actually we really need to hone workable democratic solutions through proper, fair dialogue, accepting good evidence, and without the kind of disease of this false information and the kind of culture wars that freighted with that. And so the funny thing is that some of the apparent conflict has been driven by the abuse of information technology. There is no evidence that centrally controlled economies have done better on climate change and the environment than capitalist economies. Neither have done brilliantly. So we do need democracy. We need democratic dialogue to work out what the solutions which are workable for us are. I want to be very clear that we have to find. I would rather have the struggles that we have with the planet and democracy, rather than some kind of assumed. I don't think any totalitarian approach to this or utterly technocratic approach to this is going to be workable or helpful.
That's
so freeing up the dialogue for proper dialogue, and you know, the way democracy has actually solved some of the challenges that we have managed to solve would be very helpful in the first place. So I just put that out there. Yeah.
So it's going to be a struggle, is perhaps, and that we can't look for a sort of a kumbaya moment in regard to this. Margot and Steve, would you like to say something about how we should deal with conflict as people of faith in regard to this space?
Yes, I think in terms of previous examples, both acid rain and the ozone hole, which were sort of big things in the 80s, they were in a sense relatively easy to deal with. My husband's worked on acid rain, and it was just a matter of, you know, cleaning up so that we didn't have you didn't have sort of sulfur dioxide sort of going across places and killing off the trees. And that has largely been done. There's still problems in China and some other places, but largely that's happened. And the ozone hole has been better. I'm not sure if it's at such a good place now, but it has been better. But I think with climate change, it's such an all-encompassing thing. And actually our energy source, which has powered us for these generations, given us wealth beyond the dreams of our ancestors, is a very much more difficult thing for us to deal with. And, you know, there's the classic Gus Speth quote, you know, that you know, I thought the big problems were biodiversity, ecosystem collapse, and climate change, but actually they are greed, selfishness, and apathy. And I think it is actually a spiritual problem, a society problem, that we're not willing to change if it's going to make things worse for us in the short term, and we're not able to see that it's going to make us very much worse in the long term if we don't. I don't think the democracy is well set up in its you know, sort of 4 or 5 year terms to deal with it. But in terms of dealing with conflict, I think it is trying to actually stick to the facts of science, and to explain how science works, which many politicians don't, and to explain what is happening to, I think, particularly the people in the poorest parts of the world, and indeed the less well off in the wealthier parts of the world are the ones who suffer the most. And that, I think, particularly in church congregations, does begin to move people. And I think if we can, as people of faith, take this on, then I think then something else can really move forward. But I'll hand over to Steve. Said enough, I'm sure.
Well, I think the matter of dealing with conflict is a very difficult one. I mean, I do believe, and here in part I'm talking as a socialist, I mean, I do think that it's capitalism that's at the heart of the problem. The problem is that our minds are colonized by capitalism, which includes encouraging people to think almost exclusively about themselves, maybe their own families too, but about their individual fate, rather than thinking collectively. And you know, the problem with a capitalist system, I believe, is that it depends upon continuous compounded growth. And continuous compounded growth is not something that just happens on paper. It involves the increased material throughput of physical resources. Some of you may have heard the term overshoot. That, you know, right now, after a date in approximately early August, I think it is, every year, people on Earth are consuming more physical resources than the Earth can regenerate. And that's happening every year. After about early August, in other words, we're living on borrowed time. We're working with resources that aren't being replenished. And of course, that's at the root of our crisis, I think. Yeah, by the way, I just quickly would also add, I think Margot has a good point that this can, and here I'm speaking as a GreenFaith fellow, which is an ecumenical group that trains people to advocate on environmental issues within congregations. I do think that faith congregations can be an effective counterweight to this selfish thinking I've talked about, because I think faith communities are one of the few forces we have in society now that try to encourage us to think in an anti-capitalist, in other words, a collectivist way. So that's the one place I can find some hope. Thanks.
Thank you both. And I thought that, Margot, your point about bringing it back to congregations and response within congregations was a very good and important point. We have a question from the Reverend Paul Rooney, who's also a scientist. He asks the questions that, even though he says as a scientist he's grounded in facts and evidence, that he asks, don't you think that more and more we need parables because most people can't get science facts? If the three of you have got something to say about that, or if you'd like to just address that, don't you think that more and more we need parables because most people just can't get science facts?
Yes, I think I'd absolutely agree with that. We need to tell stories, and George's work in Tomorrow Now and those really amazingly localized weather forecasts is one story of how you can see adaptation. Another story is Bangladesh, where whole communities are going underwater, or there's saline intrusion, so their fields, even when the water goes back, are full of salt, and they end up in shanty towns on the edge of cities. And those sorts of stories can begin to help people to see where it fits. But perhaps more than that is to also see how this might be part of our faith. And I think that's another question that I know, I've been working on environment and speaking on churches on it for about 25 years. And back in the late 90s, you tend to get patted on the head and said, well, we like daffodils too. And I think it's actually to show how this is an integral part of our faith, that we're called to care for creation, that we're called to love the world that God gave us, and that Christ died to reconcile all things through his bloodshed on the cross. So it's absolutely fundamental to care for that, and caring for people and caring for the natural world go together. And stories that will show that and will make it more real for people, I think, are really good ones, whether that's also about churches that church congregations and communities that are making that difference. All those things can make a big difference in the way people will relate to it.
Thank you, Margot. Stephen, Mark, parables, and if I can add something, is this something that where the church might have a strong advantage over other institutions?
I think the reimagining of who we are, and if you think of parable and you think of taking a parabolic approach, coming around the side, taking by surprise, then those, parables reimagine, right? They take one thing that you've assumed in one way, they reposition, reimagine. They're reflexive in that way. So they reorientate us into the right direction. If we are in the wrong order in creation, if we're in wrong relationship with creation around us, then parables definitely can help. And I've done a piece of work looking at the parable of the prodigal son. And it's really interesting that for at least something like the last century, the interpretation of parables like the lost son, like the good shepherd, all of those things, it changes from being much closer, much less metaphoric to being more metaphoric after we mostly live in cities. So it doesn't, our changing understanding of those doesn't change at the Enlightenment. It doesn't change it in the Industrial Revolution. It changes once we're mostly living in cities. All of a sudden, we lose the fact that the parable of the prodigal son revolves around this farm, this oikos, and the farmstead is the place of God's promise in creation. The promise of creation, the promise of life in abundance, is on this family farm, or oikos. So the ecology of that picture of living in just balance, a mutual life together with the good of the family farm, as opposed to this kind of cash economy that the younger son sells up for, in the process of which proclaiming his own dad dead, because to claim his inheritance is to claim him dead. So the parable has this kind of currency, the eternal currency of life and death, while there's this superficial currency of the younger son's cash, which runs out. So I think a parable like that, I think, can reorientate us. But I do think in that reorientation, the first thing that we've got to understand is our sinfulness. The younger son only comes back to the family farm having identified his sin. Interestingly, when he is living abroad, he's in disorder. He's forced to muck out the pigs and even to eat their food. So he's in ecological disorder when he lives abroad in the kind of Jewish imagination. So I think they are really important, and that work of reimagining I think this is, one of the pieces of work that we have to do. And I also think, things like us being in wrong order in our minds, these are the reasons why our mental health is strongly linked in with these things. So yeah, there's a few things. In the end, it's a beginning and ending thing, isn't it? It's creation and the end and purpose of creation. So it's what Margaret says about it being fundamental to our faith. Absolutely, it's a beginning and end thing. And if we miss the ecological picture of the prodigal son because of urbanization, and we miss the real grounds of that story, then the cross is an ecological picture, right? The cross is life and death, and a real person suffering in a really creaturely way. So the cross is God's ecology.
That's interesting. So there's a couple of things there of the context of stories and our relationship to the stories, and how that comes back to us as Christians in relation to the cross.
I recognise loads of I've been a Brit, all the kind of good we were doing, the Great White Hope we were doing around kind of justice and stuff during the original missionary times. We have to recognise ourselves in this as sinners. Living in Gloucester, Tewkesbury, all the surrounding areas flood every other year. People 5 miles from that don't appear to give a toss. They forget about it the next year. They vote. The 17% of people voted for reform this year in Gloucester. 17%. And they are living with the effects of climate change every other year. Some families get, when the sewers overflow, when the waters flood, they get shit in their living rooms every single Christmas. And their neighbors 10 miles down the road don't appear to care. We are really sinful in this.
Okay, thank you. Our response as human beings is
really,
still
really
predominantly sinful to this whole thing.
Very,
and Steve, what do you?
Just on the subject of parables, I think I'll defer to my ordained colleagues here as being much greater authorities on those than I am. Now, I'm not sure this is
not necessarily.
I'm not sure if this is a parable or not, but I'll mention the name Greta Thunberg. When she first came to prominence 5 or 6 years ago, and she was just 17 or 18 at the time. Here was suddenly this young person who was becoming a major spokesman for the climate movement around the world. And that, you couldn't really call it a parable, I guess, but she provided a whole different model. She suddenly slapped people in the face and said, you've got to realize this is most going to affect people who are my age, who, many of you climate scientists are in your 50s or 60s or later. I appreciate what you're doing, but all of this, if we don't check it and change it, is going to affect people my age and younger. So she provided, I think, a whole new model for thinking about this, and I appreciate it.
And
so people as parables, yes.
Yeah, she also had a very good parable herself at Davos when she said that we need to act as if the house is on fire because it is, and that language was really picked up on. I think we've got time for 2 more quick questions, and
I just got one more very quick response on the parable thing, which is I sat down with he's a very centre-right politician who'd just been pilloried for apologizing for something, and his colleagues just thought he was weak for ever saying an apology for something that had been going catastrophically wrong for 5 years. And he, we happened to have a conversation not long after. I said, look, the right constantly wants to say that our justice system is based on the Judeo-Christian scriptures. Well, the Judeo-Christian scriptures couldn't be stronger and clearer on generational justice. So where is generational justice in our justice system? It's just not there. It's perhaps the singular most important theme of the Old Testament. And it's not even there in Western justice system. So I think there's something quite important to say to the right in that, which they might listen to. I think there's some leverage there that could be helpful. Okay, I'll move on.
And I think that the next question that has come up, I think actually is a way to draw some of those threads together from a personal point of view. And the question, I think, comes down to, how can the climate crisis be presented in a way that is not just about caring for others and our planet, but also a matter of self-interest? Now, that might seem as though it's selfish, but the question is, I wonder if people can feel that they have a personal stake in saving our planet. How do you do that for somebody who's 10 miles away from flooding, or living 10 miles away from where flooding? How can we get people to feel that they have a personal stake in saving our planet, especially if in the West, when we can be cushioned so many ways, from climate change?
I don't know how much longer we can be cushioned, really, when you think of the story I've just given with this 200 million or more cost in one peninsula with a population of 10,000 people. I don't think we will be cushioned for much longer. I think we're living slightly in fantasy land when we think we are. Look at the deaths in Spain. 260 people. And if you saw the faces of those people in those cities, they were really not scared. They were really, really annoyed at the politicians. So these kind of hegemonic politicians who kind of, are winning through the populist thing. Everybody much prefer it if climate change wasn't happening. The obvious populist thing to say is climate change isn't happening, because that's what everyone would prefer. It's the easiest solution to this problem, to pretend it's not happening, or the easiest apparent solution. Now, those people can't survive when families start getting flooded out and lose their entire livelihoods. It's hard to believe that they can, but the selfishness is strong, right? Because the death count in Florida was several hundred this year from intensified storms, far higher than it's ever been in living memory. And DeSantis got in again. He can't stand for a lot longer when these things continue to happen. Reality, the shit has to hit the fan eventually with characters like that. I think really important things to do in regions is to show the bill. To show the bill, and also to show people the part of that bill that they are having to pay themselves. That might be lost revenue from people from those flooded out towns losing their incomes and not being able to spend it in your nearby town. There might be all sorts of things. I think I like to say Jesus loves a win-win. And at the moment, this is a kind of, we're pursuing a massive win-lose thing where, fewer people are going to win anything at all, and there's less overall to be winning anyway. And so I think emphasizing the mutuality of it, emphasizing the enlightened self-interest is a big way to go. Yeah.
I think as well, when you look at the whole world is being done up, we talked about economic growth and the instability of that. Moving to measures of well-being, I think, are becoming more sort of thought about, because there's no good having all the wealth in the world and not have well-being. And that I think, with the increasing mental health issues, especially amongst young people. Again, I think the parable of the man who expanded his barns and then died is quite a good one for our age. It's what we've been doing in the West, and in ways in which we can increase our. I mean, the storms that's battering our house at the moment are probably made worse by the warmer sea that we have. We know it's uncertain. We've got the problem with the jet streams where they are, but these things, I think, to say, well, actually, it does affect us. It will affect us. The numbers of migrants we're going to get as things warm, and how we're going to manage with that is also a major issue. If we think we've got a lot of migrants now, it's nothing compared to what's going to happen. Look at what Spain is doing at the moment. What happens if we do go to 3 degrees, which is where we're heading by the end of this century if we don't do anything about it? So I think there is a sense in which we can do it at personal level, but also at large level. We've moved to our own house and we've put in solar with a battery, and we're finding we're using hardly any electricity from the grid. Even this week, we were putting energy back into the grid, having filled our battery from the sunshine. It's a much nicer way to live. It's a much cleaner way than using fossil fuels, and to somehow convince people that as we move from kind of wood and water to fossil fuels, we now need to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and we can see that make a difference. But it is hard for people to see beyond the immediate. And I think that's where things are falling down, particularly in some of the elections, particularly the political instability that is moving things to the right. How do we actually bring, and extreme left, so how do we bring things back more to the centre ground? I think is very important.
And Steve, especially, how do we move people beyond the
Well, I would
immediate?
only say this, then we can move on. In response to one thing Margot said, I think we should keep in mind that renewable energy is not entirely carbon-free. It takes a lot of fossil fuel to produce solar panels and wind turbines, a lot of it. So, you know, it is a good thing. I'm in favor of going to more renewable energy, but we have to think about, in a deeper way, about changing the social relations we have under capitalism if we're really going to make a difference.
I think as well, if I can just quickly respond to that, one of the kickbacks against using renewables has been to say that they're using fossil fuels. If you look though at the running of them compared to constantly using fossil fuels to have more fossil fuel energy, there's just no comparison. Compare an electric car with a fossil fuel car. And there may be problems in production, but actually in running, it completely outweighs it. But we do need to actually use less energy. We need to change the way we live. We need to think differently. And I think thinking about well-being and how we can prioritize that is actually doing things more locally, working in community locally, are all ways in which we actually will have a happier life than tearing around the world the whole time. But how do we actually begin to make these things a reality?
Right. So thank you, the three of you. I think that's the questions are very interesting, and I think that it's a knotty problem, and so on, and it comes back to being a spiritual problem. As we're sort of coming towards the end of our session, I was just wondering if the three of you would like to sum up in one or two sentences some of the things that you feel are important that have come out of this discussion. So just one or two sentences from each of you, if you might be able, if you feel able to do that. Say Mark. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, you did put me on the spot quite a bit then. Okay, Jeremy, we're old friends. I think, you know, so let's look at let's just take a moment. So this isn't the perfect kind of perfectly formulated thing, but the point about growth, I think you can actually see this in the US election, because it's abundantly clear that the actual figure of growth, which was strong at the point of the election and in the run up to it, was nothing to do with it, how people felt, which is kind of what Margot's saying. It's how do people see? And I just want to push back a bit with Steve, because, you know, where we've had, you know, more socialist economies, they don't end up always being great on climate change and the environment. The Labour Party in our country, with solid socialist roots, workers don't always understand the sacrifices that might need to be made for the sake of the next generation either. And so it's not a straightforward equation there, I'm afraid. And some of the solutions, you know, Elon Musk and electric cars, let's just leave it at that. I mean, there's a confusing picture if ever there was one. Okay, the last really important picture, one of the most important things I think we've got here is C.S. Lewis in his science fiction trilogy. The final picture is this absolute bloodbath, and it's grim. It's a horror show, bloodbath, in his story. In C.S. Lewis, it's not Narnia, let me tell you. Absolute horror show, bloodbath of kind of technology and a modernist kind of reductive capitalism just pushing through and literally murdering everything around. While one of his ideas of paradise is a proper balance with a balanced kind of hunting, you know, one-on-one hunting, if you like, man versus creature. And in C.S. Lewis, it is man, because that was the era. And so and C.S. Lewis has a lot of traction with the right in the US. And I think that the balance point there, as in living in right relation, is could be a real important source for us.
And that trilogy was written 70 years ago. Thank you.
Yep.
Margot and Steve.
But in a culturally quite interestingly similar time.
I like the idea of parable, and I know as a church leader, if you wanted to take a congregation forward, you have to paint a picture of where you're taking them. It has to be a story. The story has to have some light at the end of it, and I think that is where we need to be. Things are getting dark, and they're going to get darker, but we have to be that light, and we have to be able to lead and enable our congregations to have the strength to also be that light. And we are so much, I mean, in this country, we're doing so much for things like food banks and other things. We're very much there for those in need. And I think as things go on, to be there for a planet in need is how I think we will be able to take things forward.
Thank you,
And
Margot.
I would just briefly add, check out the degrowth movement. It is, I think degrowth is still a relatively small but a growing movement. If you take the word degrowth, anyone here, and just Google it, you'll come up with all kinds of resources and all kinds of organizations. You can probably even join a local degrowth group. And these are the people that are challenging that unlimited exponential model of growth that we get from capitalism. And in my view, it's the very last chance that we have for averting total climate catastrophe and collapse.
Sobering words, and with parables. So I just want to fake out.
One last thing. Of course, the pyramids and the Tower of Babel, two great technological projects in Scripture, and the Tower of Babel fell over, and the pyramids, it took them 40 years in the wilderness to get over. So there is a thing there. So
Margot, Mark and Steve, thank you very much for these important contributions. And let me just hand over to Lee for a summary, summing up of this session.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all very, very much. We began with a couple of very sobering diagnoses that the lack of response to climate change, climate safe change itself, is a manifestation of a spiritual problem, right? And in the end, that's individual and a packet of individual and communal sins, and that also we are reaching the point where no amount of wealth or government expenditure will be able to insulate really anyone from severe consequences for much longer. On the other hand, I think we've uncovered a number of hopeful approaches that people can be taught and learn to move spiritually in congregations, that parables and other forms of storytelling can teach us about the danger and reorient us towards the needs of nature and the communal needs, and really to uncovering and responding to what God is calling us to do in this time of global challenge. We've also learned that the very fact that we can't be insulated from, no one can be insulated from this, means that everyone has a self-interest, in a personal stake in saving the planet. So pure altruism alone, religion alone, the needs of others alone are not all that can be appealed to here. And we also heard about the potential importance of well-being beyond wealth. So for all these reasons, I'm leaving this with some rekindled hope. So again, I'd like to thank the speakers. I'd like to thank the the audience for devoting more than an hour to this. We will send out this meeting was recorded, and so is the previous one, and everyone should receive an automated email in the coming days, pointing them at the video of this session and the preceding session in YouTube that you can review and again if you like, and also pass on to others that might be interested. Finally, you also receive an email asking if you have any input into the topic we'll choose for next year. And in more months, I hope you'll welcome an email announcement of next year's program, whatever that topic may be. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your day.